Perhaps I'll give a brief introduction as to what our topic is today, because I used a title which is a little obscure perhaps. Talk is cheap. And of course, the implication there is that we don't want just talk, we want action. Actually, the subject that I had in mind had a different title. And as the week went by, I kind of changed it. And I'm not sure why, but the original title was the collection for the believers in Jerusalem. And then I thought, who preaches a sermon on a collection or about an offering? Well, maybe a treasurer does, but who else would? Nevertheless, this topic is very, very important and was important to the Apostle Paul. And in fact, his concern for the fate of the believers in Jerusalem was so great. As a result of this famine, he was concerned about a famine that had broken out, not just in Jerusalem, but right around the whole of the Roman Empire at the time. And he was so concerned about it, he motivated the members of the various churches that he'd been involved in raising up and got them to make donations to the believers in Jerusalem. And that was a very important step, really, for a number of reasons. You see, the different churches in those that he'd set up were in different geographic locations. They were all over the place. They were in Galatia. In fact, you've just got to go through the book titles of his epistles. You know, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians. And so they were in Galatia, they were in Ephesus, in Philippi. And they were also in Corinth, of course, Ephesus. But each congregation, as you can imagine in those days, was pretty much separate from every other congregation. It kind of worked that way. They didn't have the communications that we have today. And so we had, or they had, separate entities, separate groups of people who didn't really have a lot of contact with each other. I mean, much more than the primitive people in New Guinea had. They've got 600 languages there, where people lived in different valleys and, never ventured out, or they may have been finished up in the dinner pot. But it was more sophisticated than that. They had more interaction between each other than that. But they were still isolated communities. And you can well imagine that. The collection gave them a unified purpose. And so this big collection that Paul had organised, and I should say collections because there were two, these collections helped to give them a common cause or a common passion, a common interest that they didn't previously have. And it enabled them to think beyond themselves and beyond their own communities. And, we have something on the screen, do we? There are two monitors and I can see what we need to be looking at, but they're not on the main screen yet. But these collections that Paul made opened people's minds to what was happening elsewhere, made them more conscious of the needs elsewhere, and got them out of the old habit of being charitable just at home. You know, you have the old saying, charity begins at home. And it did very much in the ancient world. It was this giving to someone, to a culture that is not yours, in a place that's far away from where you live, was pretty foreign to their way of thinking. And something new happened when Paul opened up their minds to the potentials. I'm wondering if we could have a look at a text now, and I was relying on what was on the screen for my Bible, so there might be a Bible down there that I can borrow. Thank you very much. Let's go to the last chapter of 1 Corinthians. Now, I know I've been talking about 1 Corinthians quite a bit because we've worked really right through the whole book, and we've come to the last chapter, and the first 4 verses there, chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, are really the key texts for what we're discussing today. And here Paul says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches in Galatia, so do you also. And he goes on to say, on the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. And when I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Now we know that 1 Corinthians is really a response to a set of questions that the believers in Corinth had sent to Paul. Paul had spent 18 months in Corinth setting up the church. Now he'd moved on to Ephesus. But there were some issues going on in Corinth, and some people there wrote to him with, I see a thumb. Ah, right. Okay, talk is cheap. So what I've said so far we won't send you the bill for that. All right, let's try to catch that up. Paul's collections for Jerusalem, how they record of this famine in Jerusalem actually was before it happened. And you can read about that also in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 to 30. And there was a chap called Agabus. He was based in Jerusalem. Okay. We're having a great morning here. It's wonderful, isn't it? The things that we can enjoy. So Agabus, he was a prophet. He didn't write any books in the Bible, but he was still a prophet. Apparently you don't have to be a Bible writer to be a prophet. And Agabus came down from Jerusalem to a place called Antioch. And there he stood up, and it states here, through the Spirit, he predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. And this happened in the reign of Claudius, as the Bible tells us. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. And this they did, sending their gifts to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. And it did happen. The collection was made in Antioch and to the other churches through Galatia, and Paul took the money to Jerusalem. Let's have a look at a bit of historical confirmation of this. As Agabus had predicted, the famine affected much of the Roman Empire during the time of Claudius. Josephus, in his book called Antiquities of the Jews, he wrote that many people died in Jerusalem during the famine. And the famine was also mentioned by the Venerable Bede. You might have heard of the Venerable Bede. He was an English Christian way back in the 7th century, 7th, 8th century. And he wrote that Claudius was the first Roman emperor to land in Britain since Julius Caesar in the 46th year after the birth of Christ. So here we have a bit of extra-biblical or outside of the Bible confirmation of this famine. This was the year in which a very serious famine occurred in Syria, which is mentioned in Acts of the Apostles as having been foretold by the prophet Agabus. So here are the words. It's Luke, of course, who is writing this, or wrote the account that we have in Acts. Here's another historical confirmation of that. Scanty crops, too, and consequent famine were regarded as a token of calamity. Nor were they merely whispered complaints, while Claudius, that statue of Claudius there, the emperor of Rome, was administering justice. The populace crowded around him with a boisterous clamour and drove him to a corner of the forum where they violently pressed on him until he broke through the furious mob with a body of soldiers. So here's a bunch of hungry people in Rome, and they are about to attack their emperor, Claudius. People didn't like politicians then either, particularly when things went wrong. And so Paul started fundraising, particularly for the believers in Jerusalem. They were in a very difficult situation. The authorities who might have been helping their people in Jerusalem, the Christians, of course, weren't the favourite people so far as the Jews were concerned, and so they would be the last in line to get any help. And so the first of these collections was a collection by the church at Antioch, which I described a little earlier, and we read about that in Acts chapter, or could read in chapter 11. It's also mentioned very briefly in Galatians. And then there was a separate collection from the Macedonian or the Greek churches, and that's referred to in Romans chapter 15 and also in 1 Corinthians 16 as we were reading. And it's also mentioned in quite a larger portion of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And you can see here the right over on the right, it's where Antioch was, Jerusalem down here. It's not actually named on the map, but it takes us down into where Jerusalem was. And so Agabus had come up here to Antioch, made his prophecy. The first collection was in this Asia Minor area, and the second was among the Greek churches. And we'll see that the Greeks, particularly in Corinth, were at first, they agreed to make gifts, but they're a bit slow about actually parting with the money. And Paul was encouraging them to honour their pledges. So today we'll be having a look at how these organised collections were a statement of the unity of the church, in which both Jews and Gentiles came together as the body of Christ. And we talked about that a few minutes ago. It's also a practical demonstration of the grace of God made available through the gospel. We've received the gift of eternal life through Christ, and those of us who have received that, really we should be also willing to give and to share and to be involved in the work of the church. It's also an example of planned, systematic giving, and we'll have a focus on that in a moment as well, and of course of helping the needy both within the church and in the community. Now, Paul's attempts to convince the churches to give money for the saints in Jerusalem stands out when compared to the practices of pagan societies. And we mentioned that also just a few minutes ago in our preamble. And perhaps his difficulties with the Corinthians may reflect their inability to understand why they should financially support people who lived a long way from them and were entirely a different culture. And Christianity helped, as we described, to break down those barriers. In particular, the collections that were undertaken did that. Now, the second collection, this spanned almost the entire ministry of Paul, and it occupies significant portions of the Pauline epistles. You can see it's in 1 Corinthians 16, 1-4, which we just read. It's also 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 through to 9:15, and it's in Romans chapter 15, verses 14 to 32. And it was something that Paul claimed he was even prepared to die for, was this mission that he had. I wonder if it's possible for me to click on that Romans 15 and verse 30 and see if something opens up. Well, it might be easier actually just to open our Bibles. Romans 15 and verse 30. Now I urge you, brethren, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers for God, that I may be rescued from those who are disobedient in Judea, and that my service for Jerusalem may prove acceptable to the saints. He wanted to be rescued from the Jews in Judea. He was going to take this money personally to Jerusalem to deliver it to the elders there. And his concern was that the Jewish people, Jewish leaders, of which he had previously been one and now they hated him, that they would get him. And his life was at risk. But in spite of that, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And we know from the history of his life that he was arrested in Jerusalem. And he may well have been executed there, except that as a Roman citizen he appealed to Caesar and he was taken to Rome. And there he was subsequently executed several years later. Now, why isn't that moving? Do you mind moving that on to the next slide? For some reason this is not operating here. Yeah, here we are. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4. It's the verse we read before. Now about the collection for the Lord's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. So this is the second one. He'd been to Galatia. He told the Galatians to have a collection. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. And if it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. Now there's a number of things that stand out in this verse. Our Sunday keeping friends like to point to this verse as evidence that the early Christians were meeting on the first day of the week. And that Paul, in fact, was encouraging them to meet on the first day of the week. Well, the first thing we would say there is there's no mention of a meeting in this verse. It may be, it's assumed by some that there was a meeting, but Paul could just as easily have been saying, look, in a systematic way, on the first day of every week, put aside some money. And then when I come back to Corinth to collect this money from you with my friends, we'll take it to Jerusalem. But some suggest this may be the beginnings of Sunday or first day meetings. And so the question we're looking at now is, did the early Christians meet regularly on Sunday for worship? And if so, when did all this start? Well, here is the first Sunday meeting. We know there are at least two occasions referred to in the New Testament when they did meet on Sunday. The first of those was the day of the resurrection. And that night, the 11 who were left, the 11 disciples who were left, and Judas wasn't among them obviously, but the rest of them, they met. And we're reading in John chapter 20, verse 19 here. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." So they had their doors all locked up. They were afraid the Jews might be coming after them. But why were they meeting on the first day of the week? Well, it would be natural for them to meet, wouldn't it, on the day of the resurrection? But were they meeting to honour the resurrection? Well, if we have a look at Mark's account, the answer is absolutely not. Because Mark mentioned in Mark 16, verses 9 to 11, that Mary Magdalene, who had discovered the empty tomb, you might remember, along with Mary, the mother of James, they came there after the Sabbath to anoint the body of Jesus, and they found the tomb was empty. And it says that here in Mark's account that at this meeting, this Sunday night meeting, the assembled disciples there, the 11, they didn't believe the women. So the women said that they had seen the empty tomb, that he was gone. They didn't believe it, not even the disciples. And it also says in verses 12 and 13 that the two men who walked with Jesus, on the road to Emmaus, they said they'd met Jesus, and the other disciples, it says, didn't believe it. They didn't believe it either. And when the 11 remaining disciples were eating, Jesus appeared and rebuked them for their stubborn refusal to believe. So I think we can say absolutely that the purpose of that meeting was not to honour the resurrection. It had happened, but they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it had happened, not yet. The other meeting on a Sunday that the New Testament refers to happened at a place called Troas. And we read about that, Acts chapter 20, verse 6. We sailed from Philippi and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Now, that generally means that they were having communion service. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking till midnight. That won't happen here today, by the way. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on and on. And he fell out the window. And Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him and said, "Don't be alarmed." Now, this meeting clearly did happen on the first day of the week. There's no getting around that. But was it Sunday? It says there in verse 6 that they stayed there 7 days. So there for a whole week. There's no mention of anything happening on any other day of the week except the first day of the week, when they met together to have communion. Was this the beginning of Sunday worship? Well, no. And we'll see why as we proceed. In fact, if you use the Jewish way of counting days, when do they start? Remember the creation story? The evening and the morning were the first day. So when does the day start? Evening. So when does the first day of the week start? Sunset Saturday. Sunset of the seventh day. So this may well have been a Saturday night meeting. So they may well have been met together the whole day for Sabbath, gone on into the meeting, had a common meal together, because when they had communion, it wasn't the way we do it, it was a full meal. So they had their evening meal. And Paul, who kept on talking on and on and on, and we can see what happened. Now, if that is the correct scenario, then instead of it being the beginning of Sunday rest, what happened the very next morning? Paul set out on a walking journey. He set out on a big trip. So this explanation that it was actually Saturday night and the first day of the week, of course, starting on Sunday, seems to me to be the right one, although others look at it and they take a different view. Another verse that's sometimes referred to, and in fact I've seen some people say this refers to a meeting. It doesn't. Here John writes, it's in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So was this Sabbath? Was it Sunday? We know that Jesus described himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. Or could it be that he was referring to the day of the Lord? After all, Revelation is all about prophecy to the second advent. I don't know that we can be absolutely sure, but we can be certain there's no meeting referred to here, and there's nothing in here to say that one day had replaced another. In the early church, worship, we're finding out, consisted of Sabbath keeping and resurrection celebrating on 2 different days. And it just sort of came about that way over the centuries. So the Sabbath was still kept as the day of rest and didn't become the day of rest until the 4th century. We know that because that was when the first law was promulgated about Sunday rest. But in the meantime, yes, they may well have met on Sundays or any other day of the week. After all, the early Christians, as we see in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, some of them met daily. The Lord's Supper was first instituted on what day of the week? Was it Friday or was it Thursday night? It was Thursday night, yes. Yes, he was arrested later that night. Crucified, of course, on the Friday, rested in the tomb on the Saturday or the Sabbath, and was resurrected after the Sabbath was passed on the Sunday. One of our scholars within our church, he's passed away now. In fact, he died back in 2008. The age of 70, Samuel Bakioki. Some of you may remember him. He visited this church and preached right here some years ago. And he was born in Rome, Italian obviously, and he attended the Catholic University. And there he wrote a thesis about the change from Sabbath to Sunday. And he is recognised as probably the best authority on the Sabbath within our church. His last job was at Andrews University, where he was professor. And here he writes, in my dissertation from Sabbath to Sunday, I've shown that the Bishop of Rome did indeed pioneer the change in the day of worship. What precipitated the need to change the Sabbath to Sunday was the anti-Jewish and anti-Sabbath legislation promulgated in 135 AD by the Emperor Hadrian. And it seems that according to his interpretation, which I've no need to question, it became uncomfortable for the Christians who were seen as Jews, even though they weren't Jews, and therefore would have been caught by this law that was anti-Jewish, decided that they would perhaps just focus on their Sunday evening meetings and forget about the Sabbath ones. That didn't happen universally, but it apparently happened progressively. But the first mention of a Sunday rest was in the law issued by Constantine, and that was in 321. And Sunday didn't become a day of rest until then. Christians predominantly kept the Sabbath as a day of rest, even though many of them did worship or meet to worship and have the Lord's Supper on Sunday evenings. Sunday morning worship came in somewhat later still. And this was on the venerable day of the sun. Constantine, of course, who issued this first Sunday law, he professed to be converted to Christianity at the just prior to the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He said he saw a cross up in the sky, and by this sign conquer, and he went and conquered Rome. But he, at the same time, was supporting sun worship. And this law actually supported sun worship and enforced the day of the sun, or it's called the Venerable Day of the Sun. However, the Roman Catholic Church makes a pretty bold claim. You've probably heard this already or previously. Protestants who say that they go by the Bible and the Bible only, they do not believe anything that's not in the Bible, must be rather puzzled by the keeping of Sunday when God distinctly says, keep holy the Sabbath day. The word Sunday does not come anywhere in the Bible, so without knowing it, they're obeying the authority of the Catholic Church. So our conclusions here is that the disciples, including Paul, had no plans to make Sunday a day of worship. There's no hint in the New Testament that Jesus or his disciples changed the day of worship from Sabbath to Sunday. Nowhere in the New Testament is there a command to worship on Sunday as a memorial to the resurrection of Jesus. And since there's no scriptural evidence that the disciples changed the Sabbath to Sunday, this change must have been accepted by the Christian church after the Bible was written and after all the disciples had died. Coming back to this key text, now about the collection for the Lord's people, he says, and this is in 1 Corinthians 16 now, it's the same verse. He's saying to lay aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. This prompts the question, in keeping with your income. Why did he say that? And another question related to it is, does the New Testament say anything about tithing? Well, there are some references to tithing in the New Testament. Jesus criticised the scribes and the Pharisees, saying you're paying tithe on mint and anise and cumin and all sorts of small things, and you're leaving aside the weightier matters of the law. Now, this you ought to have done. In other words, you ought to have paid your tithe, but you should also have done these more important things about justice and mercy and so on. And the Pharisees boasted, I give tithes of all that I possess. And in the Epistle to the Hebrews, there's a reference to Abraham paying tithes to Melchizedek. And so this give in keeping with your income is an interesting expression. Now, we know that we have tithes and offerings. And so the encouragement was for people to give voluntarily. And in fact, nowhere in Paul's writings, other than perhaps that reference to Melchizedek, if in fact Paul was the author of Hebrews, which is disputed, then he didn't teach tithing, it seems. And the question pops up, but why? Why did Paul not teach tithing to his new churches? And the answer is, well, he may have done it, it's just that we don't have any record of it. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he wrote, don't you know that those who serve in the temple eat food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar receive a part of the offering? In the same way, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel to receive their living by the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights. So Paul is supporting the idea of a paid ministry using the example of the Old Testament. And how were the Levites, the priests, paid in the Old Testament? Well, it was from the tithe, wasn't it? In 2 Corinthians, and we can only refer to parts of this, he's again writing to the Corinthians. This is his second letter, not the first one. And he says, "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity." So he's praising the churches in Macedonia as he's writing this to Corinth. "For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in the service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us." Now, my suspicion is that Paul, who had grown up in the Jewish system, where they used to say, "Well, I pay my tithe, I do this, that and the other thing. What lack I yet?" And by just saying, well, by putting a number on it, like a tenth, maybe that would not only limit their generosity, because he, in some cases, wanted more, not less than that, but also he was a believer in justification by faith, not by works. And when you tick the boxes, you're referring to what you have done, your performance. And if you refer to your performance, you might say, "Well, yeah, I pay my tithe, and God gets a tenth of my money and a seventh of my time. I must be okay." And that, of course, isn't looking to the righteousness of Christ to cover our unrighteousness, but it's looking to what we do and our performance, and therefore I get the big tick because of my performance. Now, Paul was very much against that idea. Anybody who's read his epistles know that Paul taught that we're not justified by anything that we do, but it's by the grace of God. Now, I don't think that meant he was anti-tithe. In fact, this passage that we've just read would suggest that he was in favour of it. But for him, the important thing was that people would give according to how they felt God had rewarded them. He says, "I want to test your sincerity by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich." So for Paul, giving was an act of grace. In 2 Corinthians, he speaks of the collection as originating out of the grace of God. We've just read that text. And in the New Testament Greek, the word charis, or grace, refers to goodwill, loving kindness, favour to God's merciful grace. And it's used 140 times in the New Testament. When we participate in giving, we are simply responding to God's grace, his goodness, his benefaction to us. You see, fundraising for Paul was a deeply theological endeavour. It wasn't just the mechanical collecting of money and the doing of stuff that maybe you don't talk about on Sabbath. For him, it was a deeply theological endeavour. It went right to the core of his religion. And here we have a comment from a guy called David Downs. He says, "To retrace the history of the collection is to be reminded that the seemingly mundane task of fundraising was for Paul a deeply theological endeavour, one which demanded his total commitment and perseverance through intense struggle. For Paul, it was a big deal. So why did Paul encourage participation, active participation in the church? That's the question we started out with. I'm not sure what your answers are. Here are mine. He saw the need to help believers in Jerusalem due to the famine. He recognised an opportunity to help transform scattered standalone congregations into a united force for good. He believed that religion should be proactive and practical, not just theoretical. And he understood that regular planned giving would be crucial to the growth and the future stability of the church that he was called upon to help create. There's a lot more that we could say, but I know our program is not over yet, so I'm going to stop at this point and make that the concluding slide, even though there are some more to come. And I just hope that this message today gives us an insight perhaps that we didn't previously have into the importance Paul placed upon the collection for the saints. So we've had a sermon about an offering, and I hope you've had a blessing from it.